Alrighty. It is Thursday evening and it's time for another study review. Not necessarily a woke article, actually. I don't think it is. But it's certainly interesting on the rise and fall of rationality in language. Let's go. So this one came to my attention, and I thought it would be really interesting to do, particularly because it's not woke, but it gets at something that is a very observable to have happened, that has to do with our current times and the influence of postmodern thought versus Enlightenment values and Western values. And so we get into some interesting things with it. Rise and fall of rationality. This is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Also a very good article compared to the last one. I think this one is much better done. The surge of post-truth argumentation suggests that we are living in a special historical period when it comes to the balance between emotion and reasoning. To explore if this is indeed the case, we analyzed language in millions of books covering the period from 1850 to 2019, represented in Google Ngram data. We show the use of the words associated with rationality, such as determine and conclusion, rose systematically after 1850, while words related to human experience, such as feel and believe, declined. This pattern reversed over the past decades, paralleled by a shift from a collectivist to an individualistic focus, as reflected, among other things, by the ratio of singular to plural pronouns, such as I, we, he, they, and he, they. Interpreting this synchronous sea change in book language remains challenging. However, as we show, the nature of this reversal occurs in fiction as well as in nonfiction. Moreover, the pattern of change in the ratio between sentiment and rationality, flag words, since 1850 also occurs in New York Times articles, suggesting that it is not an artifact of the book corpora we analyzed. Finally, we show that word trends in books parallel trends and correspond in Google search terms, supporting the idea that changes in book language do in part reflect changes in interest. All in all, our results suggest that over the past decades, there's been a marked shift in public interest from the collective to the individual, from rationality towards emotion. So this latter part I don't necessarily agree with in terms of going from the collective to the individual. I think the reverse is more true, is that it's all about the collective, because you hear about all these different groups with the identity politics kind of things, particularly in the last few years. But being this is 2019 and a lot of the woke stuff really exploded into the spotlight in 2020, and there's a plethora of books written about it now, that's another thing. That's might be a justifiable thing of why it's not there. But the other reason here is it's also Google Ngram data. They talk about a little bit in here, and I will show it, that Google's algorithm for what they keep changes as you go through. So let us continue. Let's see. The post-truth era has taken many by surprise. Here we use a massive language analysis to demonstrate that the rise of fact-free argumentation may perhaps be understood as a part of deeper change. After the year 1850, the use of sentiment-laden words in Google Books declined dramatically, while the use of words associated with fact-based argumentation rose steadily. This pattern reversed in the 1980s, and this change accelerated around 2007, when across languages, the frequency of fact-related words dropped while emotion-laden language surged, a trend paralleled by a shift from collectivistic to individualistic language. So this is where it gets interesting with, there's going to be some interesting things about this that I have to say when we get to the collectivistic to individualistic language, because how they're basing that off of has to do with the frequency of singular pronouns versus plural pronouns. I versus we, he versus they, she versus they, those kinds of things. Plural pronouns there versus individualistic pronouns. There's a problem with that, though, when it comes to some people's preferred pronouns now are they. So suddenly they is being used in a singular to refer to a person. And so some of that they're talking about doesn't necessarily hold, because that function that they've created breaks down. The post-truth era, where feelings trump facts, may seem special when it comes to the historical balance between emotion and reasoning. However, quantifying this intuitive notion remains difficult as systematic surveys of public sentiment and worldviews do not have a long history. We address this gap by systematically analyzing word use in millions of books in English and Spanish covering the period from 1850 to 2019. Reading this amount of text would take a single person millennia, but computational analysis of trends and related word frequencies may hint at aspects of cultural change. Print culture is selective and cannot be interpreted as straightforward reflection of the culture in a broader sense. Also, the popularity of particular words and phrases in a language can change for many reasons, including technological context, carriage or computer, so think of like typewriter carriage versus typing on a computer, and the meaning of some words can change profoundly over time. And what they highlight here is the word gay. In Old English, gay meant happy. Literally, you're very happy. Gay now is a sexual orientation. Okay? Nonetheless, across large amounts of words, patterns of change in frequencies may to some degree reflect the changes in the way people see and feel and see the world. Assuming that concepts that are more abundantly referred to in books in part represent concepts that readers at the time were more interested in. So in other words, if it appeared more frequently, we were more interested in it. That's what they're going off of here. Here, we systematically analyze long-term dynamics and frequency of the 5,000 most used words in English and Spanish in search of indicators of changing worldviews. We also analyze patterns in fiction and nonfiction separately. Moreover, we compare patterns for selected keywords in other languages to gauge the robustness and generalizability of our results. To see if results might be specific to the corpora of book language we used, we analyze how word use changed in the New York Times since 1950. In addition, to probe whether changes in frequency of words used in books does reflect interest in the corresponding concepts, we analyze how change in Google word searches related to the recent change in words used in books. Following best practices guidelines, we standardize words frequency by dividing them by the frequency of the word "an," which is an indicative of total text volume and subsequent taking z-scores. So they do have an appendix here, and that is not uncommon to see in peer-reviewed journals now that they will have an appendix full of stuff, because the main article is what points you want to really get across, and a lot of people don't like to read through giant amounts of things to find your main points in journals, so therefore have become more common to stick the main points in here, and anything that is not critical to help you sell the main points of the article, or to talk about the main points of your article, rather, goes in an appendix. Sometimes I really don't like this because there's a bit of a subjective judgment there, in that sometimes things that should be in the methods section for whatever reason end up in an appendix. And the article itself needs to be able to stand alone and make its point without people having to go to the appendix to find something that's critical. At least that's my opinion when it comes to appendices. So I try to go with that myself in my own work and demand it of others when I do reviews. If I have to go to the appendix to make the point clear in my head of what you're trying to do with the methods or with the results, that usually I flag it down right away when it comes to peer review. But the reason I read that whole first paragraph of the introduction is because, thinking of the things, they're looking at books. They know that books don't necessarily represent everything of culture, so they looked at one of the biggest newspapers, longest running newspapers in U.S. history, and they also went against Google to catch the internet kind of thing. What I'm trying to say with this is that they are covering their bases from as many different angles as they can think of, and that's a very good thing in an article to do. So that's why I'm pointing this out for you. Any of you who goes out to read a study, right, have you think about the different ways they could approach answering a question, and did they look at it? And if they didn't look at it, why didn't they look at it? Kind of thing is the question that you can ask them. Should you ever message them or find them, or well, don't harass, don't do that. But if you can ever find them or things like that, that's a good thing to ask them about. So, important point about the methods in here is they're using something called a principal components analysis, which we'll get into that in a second. Analyzing language change can imply the risk of cherry picking. Therefore, as a first unbiased exploration, we perform a principal components analysis on the z-scores of relative word frequencies in books over time. This approach seeks to capture patterns of change in a large dataset without relying on prior assumptions or search images. So, I can give you an example from the climate side, because we use principal components analysis quite frequently too. What it basically is to say you got a dataset that's really, really noisy. what you're trying to do with principal components analysis is to pick out the multiple trends that are there in that data, so that what you're left with at the end, you have a whole set of components. What's the contribution to the whole from each of these particular components? Usually, if you're looking at time series data, it's based upon, things that are going on in time, the patterns that you can pick out, or sinusoidal things that are going on in climate. What you might look at is things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation in long-term annual temperatures. It's a 3 to 7 year oscillation, so you could pick that out with a principal components analysis. So that's the kind of things. They look for the patterns in the data that's really hard to see with just your eye. And so that's a really great, rigorous, it's well-established method. It's also referred to as empirical orthogonal functions. So you can look at it that way. So in their analysis, they point this out, and there's a good reason that they did this. In both Spanish and English, the first principal component corresponds to a monotonic trend over time. So that's the first pattern they found. And why would they find a monotonic trend over time? Population is increased. We've written more books, all those kinds of things. So it's removing the variable there of frequency that just has to do with the increase in population in the United States and the massive number of books and the advancement of technology that's led to more books, more articles, and things like that over time. That's what they're trying to remove here. So because they're looking at the frequency of appearance of 5,000 words, but there's a lot more books over time where those words could appear. Does that make sense? So that's the reason for removing that. So that is a good thing. They immediately acknowledge right away, hey, we know there's population changes and increases going on and more books get written because of it. So that pattern comes out. That's not the relevant pattern of what we're interested in. The second pattern is, and that's the second principal component, shows an asymmetric U-curve or tilted hockey stick, gradually declining gradually since the Industrial Revolution and surging sharply in recent decades. Figure 1, first column. Examination of the words that score highly on opposite ends of either principal component axis, Table 1, Section 1, Appendix, suggests that in both English and Spanish, the monotonic axis captures general trends of word popularity over time. On the high end, we find more archaic terms such as civilized, ox, straw, savage, carriage, and sheriff. On the low end, corresponding to more recent times, we find words such as cola, product, ski, allergic, tech, and dummy. By contrast, the tilted hockey stick axes are dominated on the high side by words reflecting concepts that related to personal experience, such as senses, spirituality, emotions, and personal relationships, as detailed later in Table 1. By contrast, the opposite end of this axis has words related to society, including words associated with science, rational decision-making, procedures, and systems. Okay. So here's what they're talking about in this. This is the complicated big figure. And you'll see this a lot sometimes with some journals now too, where they want one big figure that sells the whole thing. I'm miffed with them in this figure that they didn't have a y-axis. I'm kind of miffed that they didn't have a y-axis, although I can understand it. Often when you're dealing with principal components analysis, one of the problems that can happen is one of your patterns has more contribution to the whole than another. And so you end up with massive axes differences, and it's very hard to see some of the little patterns that you're trying to see exactly what that second pattern looks like in a component, for example, because its magnitude may be much smaller than the primary component, that large monotonic trend that they took out. But this is the second component that they're talking about, this hockey stick feature. And what they're basically saying here is that with different words, and they go on to show this a little bit more, with intuition-related words and rationality-related words in here, what happens. So over time, they find this decrease in certain words, and then a sudden really big increase. And you can see here, this is 1850 to 2010. I'm sorry, to 2025 here. I think it's 2019. They probably just used 2025 in the legend and the axis just to make it easy. But the interesting thing here is the pattern. So you can presume with this graphic that the top end is high frequency, the bottom end is low frequency. So more frequency in a lot of these words, but less frequency in others. And this is English all literature, Spanish all literature, English fiction only, and English nonfiction, or excluding fiction, I should say. But yeah, So I'm going to keep coming back to this graphic because there's a lot of things in here that they point to themselves. But that's just the basic layout of the graphic here, is that Dynamics of 4 characteristics, English, Spanish book language, represented by Google Ngram data, A, E, I, and M. A, E, I, M. Second principal component of change in z-scores of frequencies of 5,000 most used words, B, F, J, and N. So this has to do, it comes in a little bit later, and that's actually what they're about to get into, is the sentiment associated with the words in themselves, whether it was positive sentiment or negative sentiment or what have you. And you can see these actually go down. Relative level of arousal, black, positive sentiment in blue, negative sentiment in red. So they track together pretty well. Z-scores of frequencies of flag words related to intuition, believing, spirituality, sapience. So these are your touchy-feely emotional words right here. And again, think about it. The top of the image is the high frequency, the bottom of the image is the low frequency kind of thing. Falling down, coming back up in the last couple of decades with the emotion-laden words. And then likewise, let's see, the black central line, mean shaded gray, and okay. D, H, L, and P. D, H, L, and P. Similar, but for flag words related to rationality, science, and quantification. So here's a whole bunch of those. I'm not going to read all of those words. I'm, of course, going to link this for you, and you can go read it. But you will notice it. It seems to be very the opposite kind of thing going on, right? With these components of words. As a next objective step, we analyze the change in relative frequencies of words that have been independently assessed as indicators of different aspects of emotion. Valence or unpleasantness associated with a word is a dominant aspect of many models of human emotion. A new valence ranges from low to low for words such as torture, rape, terrorism, to high, such as vacation, enjoyment, free. Some models of human emotion also include an orthogonal affirmative dimension of arousal, which can be evoked by words going from low arousal to high arousal. Good grief, that's an interesting combination there. Integrating frequency-weighted valence and arousal sentiment scores for all words from our set of 5,000 that were listed in sentiment lexicons, we arrive at an index for positive and negative sentiment, as well as arousal for the entire context of book published each year effective since 1850. In both English and Spanish, they are closely resemble the hockey stick patterns of the PCA. So what they're talking about here is the frequency of words that match to these different sentiments. So that didn't change all that much. Those words with different sentiments, they follow a very similar pattern in part to the whole here. So that's not the issue. Going off too much. And for your reference, this is actually, I'll let you look at it for a minute or two while I talk, but these are the actually contrasting concepts of words here. You know, highest scoring on PCA axis, words correlating most positively to sentiment, words declining before 1980 and rising after 1980, and words rising before 1980 and declining after 1980. So these are sentiment words on the top, and these are more rational related views on the bottom here. And that's what they're talking about in some of these with those other two bars of that first figure. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more in a moment. Sentiment analysis aroused for meaningful evaluation the effective components of language change. Sentiment indicators do not necessarily capture the full essence of sea change revealed by the principal components analysis. And that's actually what they're pointing out here, is that this looks exactly the same. It's not, except for some very important details, like this thing here doesn't match to that. That's not entirely the reason why that curve exists with the language in that second principal component. And that's why we want to get into that, right? And figure out those kinds of aspects. Let's see. Yeah, this becomes evident if we examine the words correlating and anti-correlating most strongly to the PCA axis, to the sentiment score, and to the overall hockey stick. List of the five. Okay, this is again the thing. They put an awful lot, and they did a huge analysis with this, but they put an awful lot into that appendix that probably could have gotten in here. Let's see. So this table has to do with the highest and strongest correlating words to certain things. Let's see. We're going to go a little bit further along here. A closer look at the short and also longer lists of words suggests that both personal and societal poles encompass several distinct groups of concepts. On the personal pole, we have words that would classify as related to belief, spirituality, sapience, and intuition. Imagine, compassion, forgiveness, heal, senses, food, feel, smell, and silence, and the body, knee, face, and chest, but also personal pronouns, me, she, me, you, and she. And activities, walk, sleep, and smile. By contrast, the opposing pole, tentatively labeled as societal, we have words related to science and technology, experiment, quantification, way, business and economy, corporation, social organization, jurisdiction, Congress, minister, and time and place. To test if those tentatively discerned concepts do indeed contribute individually to the seesaw we see in the PSA sentiment, we examined the historical dynamics of the separate concept roots. Most of the groups are straightforward to delineate. To obtain suggestions for populating belief, spirituality, and intuition cluster, we also used a thesaurus algorithm available at relatedwords.org, combining such search techniques such as word embedding and ConceptNet. Examining dynamics of each of the resulting clusters revealed a striking synchronomy, confirming that within each language, the shifts in interest across the concepts we identified happened very much in concert. Arguably, the opposing poles of human versus societal concepts we identified may also be interpreted in terms of how they relate to two fundamentally different cognitive modes of operation, namely, System 1, thinking fast, loosely, intuition, versus System 2, thinking slow, loosely, rationality. We test this idea by exploring clusters of words that we now filter to specifically reflect those opposed modes of thinking. For details, see. Selected intuition words are rooted in the concepts of belief, spirituality, sapience, intuition, and senses, while rationality flag words we used are rooted in the concepts of science, technology, and quantification. Plotting the dynamics of the frequencies of words in those clusters supports the view that PCA and sentiment patterns we revealed correlated to systematic change along the rationality intuition gradient, figures 1 and 3. Moreover, looking at a small set of intuition and rationality flag words across the larger collection of languages, we find roughly similar patterns. So obviously they did more than what they're telling you, because they're only showing the English and the Spanish in this article. But again, there's probably a bucket ton that ended up in the appendix, and it may very well be that what's in the appendix doesn't change the broad conclusions of the article. So what they're showing right here is the frequency of singular pronouns, the ratio of singular pronouns, the ratio of the frequency of singular pronouns to plural pronouns. And so basically, if this is over 1, then there is more singular pronouns than plural pronouns being used. Although I would wonder, question here is how many... This may change with some of the interesting things with pronouns, but the thing there is generally on average, how frequently do some of those words occur? And would it have been better to look at an anomaly frequency rather than a frequency? But that's a whole other question. That's a nerdy question on my part. But it is something of importance to see that suddenly, we were going towards more plural pronouns until we got to the 1980s, and all of a sudden that seems to have reversed, with the exception of being in fiction, where you had a lot of singular pronouns to begin with. So let's see. They talk about fiction versus nonfiction in here. That's not so much as what I'm concerned about, because you can kind of see with this English including fiction and English excluding fiction, or fiction and nonfiction. There we go. That makes more sense. But you can see a lot of these different kinds of things. What is more interesting to me, and often you can get a lot about the conclusions of an article just from its figures. Here. And that's actually something I want to show. What is it? Fiction versus nonfiction. Didn't get the chance to mark this before I started, which is bad practice on my part. Okay, this is one thing I do remember reading this earlier. I want to point this out. This is where they're talking about the end. One thing that I love with scientists, and I mean that somewhat sarcastically, is that they can be very long to say something that needs very few words. This is an example. The Google Ngram corpus has an English fiction category, which is a subset from the overall English corpus, thus making it possible to estimate word frequencies in the English subset excluding fiction too, while the resulting corpus, English excluding fiction, cannot be considered free of fiction. It may safely be assumed that its relative proportion of nonfiction is substantially higher than that in the fiction corpus. Okay. Which is basically to say the Google algorithm isn't perfect when it comes to determining fiction and nonfiction. Okay, that's basically what they're saying here. Is it's just a long way of saying, hey, we know there's probably some that got mixed up in the wrong categories. We don't think it messes with the results. And generally speaking, it doesn't here in the overall sense of it. So I just love that they went with that long of a sentence to say that. I've done it too. That's why I'm laughing. I've done it too. But it's just like, okay, you don't need that many words to say this. Let's see. It turns out that the dynamics of intuition flag words and rationality-related words run in close parallel in fiction and nonfiction. The magnitude of the surge in sentiment and intuition-related words is stronger in the overall English corpus than in the nonfiction corpus. BC, Figure 1's BC. This is likely an effect of the rising proportion of fiction in the database over the past decades, as fiction is more biased towards intuition-related words. There is a lot more fiction. So what they were talking about here is the amount of fiction in English literature was about 5% until 1975 and is about 35% now, is what it is. So that's what they're talking about when they say they think more intuition-related words has resulted in part from the increase in fiction. I partly disagree. I partially disagree. This is likely an effect. Okay, so what they're pointing out here in this section is actually all the way back up here where you're getting to the intuition-related words versus the rationality-related words. Again, the high frequency on the top and low frequency on the bottom. That they're talking about, you had all these intuition, emotion-laden words go until about here in the 1980s, and then it's spiked up really fast in the last few decades. Likewise, you've had the reverse happen in the rationality-related words. What they're talking about with that. Let's see. But this is the graphic that really sells it to me. Let's see. For comparison with the book analyses, we retrieved the use of the two key groups, the same as shown in Figure 1, right-hand columns in the New York Times since 1850. The fraction of articles in which those words occurred tend to rise over time. I think rationality-based words anyway. However, the balance between rational and intuition words reflects the same and overall trend we find for books, suggesting that neither the long-term pattern nor its recent reversal are specific to the book corpus, which is to say it's part of the larger culture in the change of language. Language and culture go hand in hand in a lot of ways. And so here, when you're dealing with semantics, you're going to remember these things sometimes. The language and culture questions. When it comes to interpretation, an important question that remains is whether trends in word frequencies do to some extent reflect trends in public interest in the corresponding concepts. This is difficult to probe in a quantitative way. Nevertheless, since 2004, one proxy for interest is the frequency with which people search a word used in Google. We therefore compare the trends in book words from 2004 until 2019 with the trends of the same words in the same time period from Google search queries. It turns out that the change in interest in particular words in Google search queries is more often positively and less often negatively correlated with the trends in use of the same words in books than expected by chance. This suggests that, indeed, trends in book language do in part reflect trends in interest, which is to say, the graphics you are seeing here with regard to the change in rationality, and I'll explain this graphic a little more in a second, is very reflective of the change in interest in language in culture, is what they're getting at with this, or what they're trying to say. What this graphic shows is the average frequency of words of rationality in their group versus the ratio of the frequency of rationally related words related to rationality, and the average frequency of intuition or emotion-laden words. So whenever this is over 1 on this axis, you would have more rationality showing up, more frequently seeing rationality-related language. When you're seeing it be less than 1, then it is more emotion-driven language. So what you see here is this is right around the 1980s in this peak in every single one. But it goes up, 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 and then it comes back down. And like right here in the New York Times, this is right around 1990 where it goes back below 1 in the New York Times. Which means there tends to be more emotion-laden words in the New York Times in the last 30-ish odd years than there has been rational words. English language broader. This is the thing right here. And I believe in the last, because this is a weird kind of quasi-logarithmic scale, it would have been somewhere in this neighborhood-ish. So probably just in the last 2 decades, the English language as a whole has, well, not the English language, the written English word in the U.S. has gotten a little bit more towards emotion-driven language than rational-driven language in here, which is concerning, and we'll get into some of that in a second. They have some interesting conclusions, but it is a trend reflected in all, including fiction, which, I mean, none of this is above 1 to begin with, so you really didn't have a whole lot of rationality-driven language, which is what you would expect. It's a fiction. But it's a fiction book. But being that it also shows up in nonfiction here, you have a lot more. This is still above 1, but it has definitely had the same precipitous drop-off from the 1980s to present. So there's some interesting things going on here. This one isn't as important, but if you want to go read at it, I look at it in the scholar in this article. But the interesting thing about this one is that this has to do with the rank coefficient of the frequency of certain pairwise words against the null model. So how frequently does it show up in the Google search queries, and what's the relationship for that 2004 to 2019 period? So a lot of these are really strong relationships, which is what you'd expect if the results they got. So let's see. Despite the close relationship between book trends and Google search patterns in recent years, it remains possible that long-term patterns we find are in part artifacts of the data and choice of words. Our choice of words. With respect to the latter, the 5,000 most frequent words in any language represent an overwhelming sample of common language use, buffering against the problem that any individual word may be subject to fashions or change meaning. That I don't necessarily agree with, because particularly in the last few years, there's a lot of words that have been attempted to be tarred and feathered with negative sentiment. So I don't know that their sentiment algorithms that they used here are going to necessarily be valid for too much longer, to be perfectly honest with that one. Our findings may, however, be subject to other systematic biases. For instance, our list of 5,000 most common words and the emotional ranking of words was determined in recent years and therefore reflects relatively recent language use. Still, probably the most important caveat of using book text is that they are a biased representation of language, a bias that may change over time. Exactly. You're dealing with a lot of history at the same time here, and what was a word viewed positively or had one particular meaning today doesn't many years ago, or the word didn't even exist all those years ago. So the trick of finding 5,000 words that existed over that amount of time, of close to 200 years in this particular sample, is a tricky challenge by itself. So there is that. And the reason I'm reading this sequence here and reading a bit of it is because I'm very pleased that they put this in here. This is basically a good chunk of this in here is basically what I'd like to call your caveat section. This work is great, but we recognize that its limitations are X, 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 and X. And that is an okay thing to do. That is something that should be done as part of a scientific journal most of the time. You want to recognize caveats that exist. And most of the time, if you're getting a good peer review, they will point it out for you that, hey, you need to probably caveat it this way because you didn't do this, this, and this is why it could affect it. And so you generally if you forgot about it yourself, you thank the peer reviewer and put it in there. Those kinds of things. So you can put those together in there and have it be a great thing here. And that's what this whole section is they're talking about the robustness of their work. They're talking about any potential biases and problems and caveats their analysis may have. So that is a very good thing to see. Okay? That is a very good thing to see that they devoted a whole section of this article to that. In conclusion, we cannot exclude the possibility that our results are biased by as yet unknown effects in the data. For instance, the rise of more causal language in the Google Books data could be related to the digital transformation, enabling libraries to collect a larger diversity of materials while staying within budget. Such known unknowns, as well as yet unknown unknowns, should be subject to future research. Nonetheless, studies using different corpora, as well as different marker words, confirm the long-term decline of sentiment-laden, positive language, and the rise of words with related to causal reasoning. Meanwhile, the dramatic recent reversal of this trend occurs in fiction as well as corpus from which much fiction has been filtered and is also found in our New York Times analysis. Thus, while it will be important to explore alternative word collections, sentiment classifications, and text corpora, it seems likely that the marked U-shaped pattern we find reflects a true dimension of language change, which is to say, we pointed out all these conclusions, but we've pointed out all these caveats, but we still think the pattern we see is really valid. That's what they're pointing out here. And these caveats, these kinds of caveats and things are pretty rare to find in the woke language, in the grievance studies kind of stuff. I don't see that as much, which is not necessarily good. Now we get into the fun part, because there's a whole section here at the end of what do they think are the reasons for that, which is much harder to pick out in these kinds of social science things, because how many confounding factors do you have with history and things going on and what have you? I have some thoughts, though, I'm going to add to this. Inferring the drivers of this stark pattern necessarily remains speculative, as language is affected by many overlapping social and cultural changes. And nonetheless, it is tempting to reflect on a few potential mechanisms. One possibility, when it comes to the trends from 1850 to 1980, is that the rapid developments in science and technology and their socioeconomic benefits drove a rise in status of the scientific approach, which gradually permeated culture, society, and its institutions, ranging from education to politics. As argued early on by Max Weber, this may have led to a process of disenchantment as the role of spiritualism dwindled in a modernized, bureaucratic, and secularized society. So in general, I kind of agree with that, in that as you had societies grow and there was more influence in scientific process and what have you, that you had more of those words start to appear. So in general, I actually kind of agree with that sentiment. What precisely caused the observed stagnation in long-term trend around 1980 remains perhaps even more difficult to pinpoint. The late 1980s witnessed the start of the internet and its growing role in society. Perhaps more importantly, they could be a connection to tensions arising from neoliberal policies which were defended on rational arguments, while the economic fruits were reaped by an increasingly small fraction of societies. In many languages, the trends in sentiment and intuition-related words accelerate around 2007. One possible explanation could be that the standards for inclusion in Google Books shifted from being in a library Google had an agreement with to from a publisher that directly deposited with Google, one of their caveats here, after 2004 to 2007, thus affecting the corpus composition. The 2007 shift also coincides with a global financial crisis, which may have had an impact. However, earlier economic crises, such as the Great Depression, did not leave discernible marks on our indicators of book language. Perhaps significantly, 2007 was also roughly the start of near-universal global surge of social media. This may be illustrated by plotting the dynamics of the word Facebook as a marker alongside the frequency of set, intuition, and rationality flag words in different languages. So what they're talking about is that pause that you see right here, and the flip all of a sudden to go back and rationality down. I actually have a different thought on why this is, and that actually has to do with postmodernism. Remember, a lot of postmodernism and critical theory and critical race theory is about the emotion of oppression and all these kinds of other things, and the emotion-laden words and the touchy-feely kind of thing transition there. And that started in the U.S., really. It started in academia in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, late 1960s, those kinds of things. And by the 1980s, really would have taken off a little bit more. You also have what was going on right around the 1970s when this pause really got to start here. Yeah, when you had this kind of pause getting started and everything was slowing down, you were right after the Civil Rights Act. And everything that went on in the 60s. So there was a lot of change and shift there that was going on in the culture right then that ended up adding more emotion-laden words and the focus on my lived experience over the actual corpus, if you will, of data that would typically be used in rational argumentation and scientific argumentation. So I would actually argue a little bit that some of the postmodernist influence there is actually what is affecting this shift to go back toward emotion-laden words rather than rationality and discussion of language that way. Or rationality in language, I should say. So that would be my thought, actually, on this. Of course, there's a myriad of things. That's just my thought in addition to what they're pointing out here. I'm speculating as they are. Let's see. So they're talking here primarily about social media, dealing with conspiracy theories and, maybe misinformation did it and all those kinds of things. That's not the paragraph I was interested in. It's the one after that. Importantly, the trend reversal we find has its origins decades before the rise of social media, suggesting that while social media may have been an amplifier, other factors must have driven the stagnation of the long-term rise of rationality around 1975 to 1980 and triggered its reversal. Perhaps a feeling that the world is run in an unfair way started to emerge in the late 1970s when the results of neoliberal policies became clear and amplified with the rise of the internet and especially social media. A central role of discontent would be consistent with the rise in language characteristic of so-called cognitive distortions known in psychology as overly negative attitudes towards oneself, the world, and the future. If disillusion with the system is indeed the core driver, a loss of interest in the rationality that helped build and defend the system could perhaps be collateral damage. They're not saying it, but that's one of the reasons why I immediately think of the postmodernists with the woke, because a lot of critical theory and postmodernism exists to tear down the current system. So more emotion-driven language, right there, as far as I see it, is the result of wokeness. It seems unlikely that we will ever be able to accurately quantify the role of different mechanisms driving language. That would be very difficult. It would be very extremely difficult to do. And that's why they're speculating a lot on what they think the reason is for this. It's because of all the different things that have gone in history, you have a very hard time quantifying that for sure. But we can speculate. And like I said, I speculate the shift from rationality back toward emotion-driven language, or more frequent use of emotion-driven words, has to do with the rise of postmodernism and critical theory in the United States, because it was around in the 1970s when it was in the 1970s when it really got started in academia in the United States. So, however, the universal and robust shift that we observe does suggest a historical rearrangement of the balance between collectivism and individualism, and inextricably linked between the rational and emotional, or framed otherwise. As the market for books and the content in the New York Times and Google search queries must somehow reflect interest of the public, it seems plausible that the change we find is indeed linked to a change in interest, but does this indeed correspond to a profound change in attitudes and thinking? Clearly, the surge of post-truth discourse does suggest a shift, and our results are consistent with the interpretation that the post-truth phenomenon is linked to a historical seesaw in the balance between two fundamental modes of thinking. If true, it may well be impossible to reverse the sea change we signal. Instead, societies may need to find a new balance, explicitly recognizing the importance of intuition and emotion, while at the same time making best use of the much-needed power of rationality and science to deal with topics in their full complexity. Striking this balance right is urgent, as rational fact-based approaches may well be essential for maintaining functional democracies and addressing global challenges such as global warming, poverty, and the loss of nature. So that is their outlook based upon this, and it is a concern that I have, because this is really the change in the language, I think, that's my speculation, that the change in the language really does reflect the wokeness. Overall, I think this study was excellently done, and was well ported in here. There's very little that I can find grief with here, except for maybe some things where, like, the frequency of the use of they and what have you. Did you account for how often it's frequently, how on average it's used anyway, versus I and we and what have you, because that could drive some of those things in this figure for why the singulars are always so high and perhaps getting higher. So you need to account for that change for a baseline. I would prefer to use the anomaly frequencies rather than the raw frequencies here in that situation, but that's me. Anomaly being a difference from an average. Okay? Because then you can say something, this is the average number of plural pronouns used, this is the average number of singular pronouns used, do a difference in the total there, and then do your trends on that. That kind of thing. Because then you get around the issue of they already have different levels of use. Kind of thing. That's why I wonder about that ratio. Is it kind of artificially inflated towards singular pronouns? Anyway. Could not be. They could also be the thing of the increasing desire for I, me, I want what's best for me kind of thing. That's distinctly possible too. Anyway, but this I think was a really well done study, with the exception of maybe putting way too much into the supplemental material instead of being here in the main article. I will link this for you, and I think you should go take a read of it. I think you folks would find it interesting and ask your own questions about it. Like I said, this is a much better article than the last one I read from PNAS, which was last week on the intersectionalities in science, which was poorly done. In my view, I was amazed it made it through peer review. But anyway, this I think was really great. And this is an example of a very decently well done article. And I'm not saying that because I would have roasted it if I found something problematic, to use the phrase, about how they did this study or methods or what have you. But a principal components analysis, I know from experience, is actually a very good and robust way to break apart these components. So I think that was a good way to go about doing it. They did a great job of bringing in caveats and what have you, even if it was a result I disagreed with. And I mean, I do disagree. I did disagree because it's like they're saying there's a shift toward more individualistic. And really what I kind of see with this, where it doesn't line up with the postmodernist kind of thing, is the postmodernist is more about collectivism. So there's a weird dynamic for you. Anyway, that's it for this particular article. I encourage you to go read it because I think it's actually very interesting. And I think to get back to our doing more rationality, we just need to start using more words that go with rationality as part of a language thing here, is start using more rational language and push back on having everything be driven about emotion, because I think maybe we can hit a balance, but it's not going to happen if this continues down the emotion driven trail that we're going on with no focus on rationality at all. Anyway, that's it. The rise and fall of rationality in language. Don't forget, after this, at 8 p.m. Central Time, we will be having a live chat in Locals exclusively for supporters. You can chat with me about the article exclusively for supporters in Locals. So if you want to be a part of that, you have to come join us. Until next time, then, I think like the video on the way out the door if you liked it. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you liked it. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. And until next time, of course, come on over to Locals and join us for some fun stuff over there. Until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious, my friends.